Good morning, everyone. So I'm Piet, and I will be presenting Kimya, which is a privacy hardening framework for smart speakers. So I find smart speakers very interesting because they come with what I call the smart speaker paradox. And so on the one hand, they promise to never be spying on their environment. But on the other hand, they also promise that whenever you address them, they will be ready to answer your queries. Now, of course, to know when they're addressed, they need to always be listening to the environment. And there's this very thin line between listening to the environment and spying on it. So today, this paradox is addressed by having a small bit of code that is just responsible for figuring out when a device is addressed. And then that code triggers a larger code base, both on the device and potentially in the cloud, that then does the more complex trigger processing. Now, the difficulty with that approach is that it requires a high level of trust in the vendor to implement that in an honest way that's actually privacy preserving, and also for the vendor to implement that in a secure way so it can't simply be bypassed by third-party adversaries. And somewhat the irony of the situation is that every single one of the large smart speaker vendors have shown in the past that, in fact, they're not as trustworthy as they would like the public to believe. This really reached a peak in 2019 when a series of newspaper articles showed that pretty much every single one of these large vendors had large groups of contract workers that were manually listening into smart speaker recordings for training purposes. And today, and to a computer science audience, that's not that much of a surprise. But back in 2019, and for the general audience, that was really a major breach of trust. And it led to headlines like this one: Apple contractors regularly hear confidential details on serial recordings, workers hear drug deals, medical details, and people having sex. So vendors are, of course, aware of this, and in order to address this situation, every single one of the smart speakers that you can get today comes with some sort of status indicator, be it a blue ring or this cloudy display or some colorful dots. But the problem with these indicators is that they're implemented in an opaque way, and there's no specification or there's no statement in how secure they actually are. So we don't know if they're run by standard software, by secure software. And in fact, we can only guess, but it's fair to think that they're actually just run by standard software. For example, Amazon has some documentation for third parties that want to Alexa enable their device, and it just says that devices need to have some sort of status indicator without further specifications. And in general, we can take the complete lack of communication and marketing over the security of these indicators as an indicator for them not being that secure at all. So that brings the question, can we do better? So one way to do better would be to place a gateway between a smart speaker's microphone and then its software runtime that's actually running all of the event detection code. And then the gateway could control whether the runtime can access the microphone or not. The problem with this attempt, though, is that the runtime runs the event detection. And so in order for the event detection to work, the runtime would need to have continuous access to the microphone, which means that the gateway must continuously grant it, which means that it could just as well not be there at all. We could try to do a bit better by placing an isolated event container in front of the gateway and between the microphone. The code running in that container would then have continuous access to the microphone data. It could perform the event detection, signal to the gateway when an event was detected, and at that point, the gateway could generate a notification in a secure way and then grant access to the sensor data to the runtime. This is already a lot better, but it still comes with a problem, and that is that we have no control over storage inside of this isolated event detection container. So if the code running in there would be malicious, it could continuously try to eavesdrop on the environment, extract sensitive information, store it on the side, right, and then wait for a legitimate event to occur to exfiltrate it together with the legitimately sampled data. So in addition to being isolated, we also need that container to be amnesic, meaning that it cannot or should not be able to store any data for longer than a predetermined amount of time. And that exactly is Kimya. So to implement this container, what Kimya does is it segments the microcontroller unit into 5 memory regions. The first 4 are the sensor region, buffer A region, buffer B region, and the scratch region. And these 4 together form the Kimya container. And then there's a 5th region that has all non-Kimya related memory in it. Next, Kimya defines 4 MCU phases. The first one of which is the idle phase. This is the phase in which the MCU starts, in which all of the non-event detection related code runs. And when in that phase, there really is only read-write access to all other memory, but no access to Kimya-related memory. The code running in the idle phase, however, can request an arbitrary function to be executed in the acquire phase. In this phase, there's read access to the sensor and read-write access to buffer A. So the code running there can sample data from the microphone, perhaps do some pre-processing, and store it in the buffer. Then, additionally, arbitrary functions can be requested to run in the process phase, where there is read-only access to both buffer A and buffer B, and read-write access to the scratch memory. And together with the acquire phase, this generates this unidirectional data flow that you can see on the right hand of the slide that can be used as a pipeline for event detection. If an event is detected, the process phase can signal that, which causes the MCU to be transitioned to the triggered phase, at which point a secure notification is generated and full read-write access is given to all of the MCU memory. So these 4 phases, they implement isolation, because at no point is access granted both to Kimya-related regions and non-Kimya-related regions, except when this notification is generated. But we said that we also need amnesia. So for that, every half a T lifetime, where T lifetime is a preset value, we run the following buffer maintenance routine. That is, we swap buffer A and buffer B, effectively switching the switch in the data flow diagram. And then we wipe the buffer that is newly being activated. And we also always wipe the scratch region. So what this does is it effectively enforces a maximum data age of T lifetime, because every buffer region is wiped every other half a T lifetime, and the scratch region is wiped every half a T lifetime. Right? And it also provides data continuity, because the buffer that's wiped always contains the oldest microphone data. So we don't have a risk of a sensor event or a trigger event being segmented by one of these buffer maintenance events. So in the paper, we look at how we can implement this on trust zone on Cortex-M. Right? And for that, we look at a bunch of more practical aspects that I don't have time to go into here today. For example, we look at the definition of what actually is an interaction with a smart speaker. When does it start and when does it end? And how can you deal with not knowing how long an interaction is going to last at the moment that the smart speaker is triggered? We also look how we can enforce isolation in a way that is compatible with existing OSs or other software that might be running on these devices, and without having covert channels through timing channels or cache channels or peripheral channels. We also implemented this on a Cortex-M33 board. And because we're using trust zone, we actually needed no additional hardware than what is standard available on one of these boards. So besides the MCU, you don't really need anything. And we evaluated Kimya by instantiating an on-chip keyword spotting, so a trigger word detection pipeline that we actually made 2 instantiations of. One that was just running directly on the MCU, right, without Kimya, without any special features, and then one that we implemented on top of the Kimya framework. And then we connected both of these to the same microphone that was sitting on a shared bus, so they both saw the exact same input data. And what we saw was that the output of the pipeline was identical, and the Kimya-enabled board only introduced about 1.2 milliseconds of additional latency, which for these kind of applications we consider to be fairly negligible. More importantly, we also saw that the spread of the latency that was introduced was very small, so this should not give any problems with scheduling efforts or such. We have more detailed benchmarks in the paper. So with that, I'd like to round up. So what we've seen is that smart speakers come with this paradox, and that current protection mechanisms really are insufficient. So what we've done is we've proposed Kimya, which provides an isolated and amnesic event detection container that introduces only low overhead, does not restrict which algorithms can be used, and is actually independent of cryptography. Thank you.